Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this strategic conversation hosted by Friends of Europe here in Brussels, Belgium. I'm Jamie Shea, I'm the Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe, and I'd like to thank all of our audience, wherever you are, for joining us today for this conversation with the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, Mircea Geoană. The Deputy Secretary General has been in post since last October, but he needs almost no introduction from me because he is genuinely one of the key historical figures in Euro-Atlantic and European integration over the last 30 years. As Foreign Affairs Minister of Romania from 2000 to 2004, he was very influential in bringing Romania into NATO and later into the European Union. As President in office of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, in 2001, he was also instrumental in helping to pacify some of the conflicts on the periphery of Europe at the time. He's been a key figure in bringing the two halves of Europe back together again after the Cold War, and therefore I'm personally delighted to see that he's also now at the helm of the Atlantic Alliance. And Minister Geoană, first of all, you've arrived at probably an interesting time, as the Chinese would put it, with all of the enormous challenges that we're facing. And I'm aware that NATO has just held two important meetings of defense ministers and shortly before that, foreign ministers to discuss the issues. And I'd like to start our strategic conversation today, inevitably, where else with the COVID-19 crisis, the crisis of all crises, and ask you, are you worried that this crisis with the economic dimensions becoming ever more important, you know, governments going into enormous deficits, that this crisis is going to have a very detrimental impact on defense spending, defense budgets, and therefore, you know, at a time when NATO faces so many big geopolitical challenges around the globe, many of them exacerbated by the crisis, that the money to fulfill the 2% defense spending pledge simply isn't going to be there. Over to you, Deputy Secretary General.
Thank you so much, Jamie. It's a privilege to be with you. You have a fantastic career and contribution to everything we discuss now. So it's a privilege to be again with you. And also Friends of Europe, such a distinguished platform and think tank. Happy to be with you and ready to engage. You know, it's first COVID. NATO as an alliance, we have a culture of solidarity embedded in our founding treaty, in the Washington Treaty. There's no other organization that puts the security and the destiny of the allied nations to the core of what we do together. So Article 5 is the ultimate expression of solidarity. And also in these very difficult months and weeks of this pandemic, allies have shown solidarity. We've seen more than 100 missions and strategic airlift providing essential medical equipment and healthcare assistance to the allied nation and to partner nations of NATO. We've seen in the last days only a continuous show of support. Even last night, we've seen a NATO SALIS operation, that's an acronym for an operation for strategic airlift, that has brought an important amount of equipment and masks to Germany. We've seen small allies, smaller countries, you know, from Slovakia to the Baltic countries, rushing to the rescue of the bigger but more affected allies like Italy or Spain. The US has sent additional support for allies like Romania. We are an alliance which is based on the culture of solidarity, and I think this is one of those times when solidarity has been proven, and I think NATO is getting out of this situation with this obligation of the core of our mission intact. Now, your question about the economic and political and geopolitical implications of the COVID-19 are legitimate. There will be probably a few months, probably years, when we have to cope with the negative economic and social impact of the pandemic. Nations will be in the situation to either to borrow money or to find fresh resources or reallocate budgetary and financial and economic resources to cope with the consequences of the virus. But I'm saying just one thing. This pandemic has not made the other security challenges and risks to our very nations, the 30 allies in NATO today, close to 1 billion people under the NATO flag, disappear. They're still here. And some of them might be been even exacerbated and amplified by this pandemic. So all of a sudden, we find ourselves in a world which is becoming even more unpredictable. So I think nations and leaders and us in the international organizations of the political West, like NATO or the EU or others, we have to make sure that when we look to the healthcare crisis, to the economic contraction, and to the security of our nations, we see them together. Because the risk to separate and rush towards multiple priorities in a moment like this could be, in the mid and longer run, detrimental to our own interest.
Yeah, Deputy Secretary General, I take the point there.
Many times, and repeating this message also with the friends of Europe. NATO has not only a culture of solidarity, but we have a culture of vigilance.
Yeah. And
vigilance should be very, very high on our agenda. Of course, there will be probably measures to be taken economically. This is something which is natural. We have to rescue businesses. We have to make sure that unemployment is not going up as it used to be 10 years ago during the financial crisis. Yeah. But I'm saying that the bulk of current and emerging threats to our security are still there. And I think smart investment in defense, in national security is important. And one last word about the role of the military.
Yep.
The
men very and women important in this crisis.
All across NATO who have been called and served together with the other civilian medical doctors and nurses, with the other people in the police or gendarmerie. Yep. They've been called and they've been done a superb job, yep, putting their personal life and health at risk. Yep. And I think that's one of the lessons learned, because this is the third dimension of NATO's culture, which is the culture of permanent adaptation and learning lessons. And in the 71 years since our inception, we have always been able to adjust to new circumstances, to cope with crisis, to keep our defense and deterrence intact, and keep the 1 billion people we represent in peace and in security. And I'm convinced that allied nations and political leaders in the capitals of the 30 nations of NATO, as we do here in the headquarters, as General Walters is doing at SHAPE, our Supreme Allied Commander. We know there will be difficult moments, but we also know that health, economy, and security are indivisible, and they make part of one single set of challenges for us all.
I see that point, Deputy Secretary General. Thank you for that. But looking ahead, when I was at NATO some years ago and looking at what emerging security challenges we should put on NATO's agenda, we were thinking at the time of energy security, of counterterrorism, of cyber defense. We didn't, frankly, think of pandemics. But in the light of the enormous impact of COVID, and probably that's not going to be the last pandemic, is NATO now thinking of adopting a more sort of systematic approach of how it can prepare itself and add even more value, whether through intelligence sharing or stockpiling equipment or whatever, special training of forces, but to be ready for the next pandemic? Will pandemics be the new challenge for the alliance, do you think?
I mentioned the culture of permanent adaptation that is in our DNA. That's why we survived and we thrived for the last 71 years. So you're right, Jamie. There will be a need, and we already started this. The defense ministers of NATO that just met through a secure VTC just a few days ago, they've tasked the alliance and also our top military commander to draw some additional responses to eventual pandemics that might come in the future too. I have to remind the ones who are watching our conversation today that NATO has already developed over decades a number of requirements for resilience. Because in the end, what we are talking about when we talk about pandemic, we talk about resilience of our healthcare systems, of our economy, of our infrastructures, of our continuity in government. And this is why building upon the bulk of big experience, including on civil military cooperation that NATO does, in civil emergency that already NATO does, we'll be expanding this, we'll be learning the lessons. And in terms of resilience across our societies, I think that next time around we'll be far better prepared. I don't know, it's not yet a decision that has been taken, but we should really look into having critical stockpiles of material, be it in NATO, be it in nations, be it in the EU. There are lessons learned that have to be addressed. But as I mentioned, NATO is in continuous adaptation. Only a few years ago, I think you're still in NATO or very close to since your departure, Jamie. We have declared cyber as another operational domain of NATO. And cyber is, even today, even during this pandemic, used and abused by state and non-state actors to amplify the interests that are not always very benevolent to the interests of the NATO allies, the NATO alliance. We have declared in London, when our leaders met just a few months ago, space, outer space, as another operational domain for us. Hybrid is another dimension. So what I'm just saying, that this pandemic is not subtracting from the long list of complex issues that we have to cope with, that are affecting or might affect now or in the future our security. But it's just adding additional complexity to an already very complex world. And I didn't mention new technologies and disruptive technologies and the competition for the technological edge that is going and raging as we speak, in terms of AI, in terms of quantum, in terms of human enhancement, in terms of many other issues that will be only accelerated by this pandemic. So I think that today we need each other more than ever. And I think the lessons learned from this pandemic is that we have to make sure that while we are addressing this immediate fantastic pressure, and we build up our resilience, and we continue to show solidarity amongst ourselves, we are also in the situation to be ready to defense, to deterrence. And this is why we are very proud that despite these difficult situations, the continuity in our missions and operations, in our battle groups in Eastern Europe, in our maritime patrolling, in air policing, our operations, which are still very massive in Afghanistan, Iraq, or Kosovo, they continue. And this is another proof of the capability of NATO to withstand any pressure, any stress, and even such a complicated moment like this pandemic.
Thanks, Deputy Secretary General. You mentioned that NATO's missions go on, and that's presumably because NATO still sees a very uncertain world out there. And some commentators have picked up the possibility that countries like Russia or China or Iran or others could try to sort of take advantage of the fact that so many NATO countries are now preoccupied with their internal domestic health and economic issues in order to sort of try to sort of push their advantage. I mean, there's been some focus on China moving more ships into the South China Sea or cracking down on human rights campaigners in Hong Kong. Russia apparently a few days ago held some quite sort of aggressive air maneuvers in the Mediterranean, in the Baltic. There's been a lot of focus on fake news. And I saw very interestingly, Deputy Secretary General, you yourself in some of your media appearances in the United States have warned that a country like China could take advantage again of our weak economic situation to buy up more critical infrastructure, vital assets, the technology that we need to have that you just referred to. Is this a worry that this kind of geopolitical chess game is going to carry on, and that again NATO may be caught napping because of course we're so preoccupied with the health of our populations at home? I mean, are you worrying about this? Is NATO worrying about this?
We never map, Jamie, as you know, and our vigilance is always on high alert. That's our job. That's our obligation. That's what we do. And I think the ultimate proof is that in very difficult circumstances, when we had to really protect our personnel, downsize and even cancel some exercises, the core function of NATO is intact, and we do our job in very good conditions. Now, there is one thing for nations to compete. There's always been a game of Realpolitik. There's always been selfish, national, or let's say sometimes cynical interest to be advanced. But what we have witnessed in this pandemic, in this crisis, it was an abundance, an avalanche, if you want, of misinformation, fake news, and conspiracy theories. And this is not okay. There's one thing to try to have, medical or masks diplomacy, to try to send support to one or another of the nations. That's something that nations do. And they try to advance their interests. That's something which is not abnormal. But once you see a malign interest in amplifying the fractures within our societies, to try to undermine the trust of our public opinion in our democratic institutions, this is not okay. And this is a red line for us. And that's why, together with the EU, together with the allied nations, together what I would call the democratic world, we are pushing back, because this is not okay. So the moment there is something like that, we act, we react. As I mentioned, we do this professionally here inside the NATO headquarters. We do this in cooperation with the others. I spoke a little bit earlier about resilience. One of the lessons learned from this crisis, if there was a need for such an additional proof, is that when it comes to essential supply chains and stockpiles of critical material for healthcare or for continuity of governments, we need to rethink some of our over-dependencies on some suppliers of ours. This doesn't mean that we should really cripple world trade. This is not the issue. But I think there will be some lessons learned. And I think the ones who are trying to abuse of this situation and try to amplify the difficult moments that we are going through, this is something that will not just pass unnoticed by us or not responded by us. And this is something that we are doing as we speak, and we're continuing to be doing in a very energetic and also in a very professional and deliberate way.
Thank you. Deputy Secretary General, unfortunately, the clock ticks very fast, particularly when there's so many things to talk about. Just a couple of minutes left, and I'd like to bring in a few questions that we've received from the Friends of Europe. We have a Debating Europe online platform where we consult regularly with the citizens of Europe. And one such citizen, Aris, has called us with a question for you, where he wants to know, how do you think COVID-19 will affect the geopolitical landscape? Will it represent a decline of the superpowers, he asks, to the benefit of regional powers? That's a big question. And I have to ask you to answer in just a few seconds, if you could, because I'd then like to just ask one or two final questions before we need to wrap up. Over to you, sir.
Thank you to the Friends of Europe for the question. Like in any dramatic circumstance, the pandemic will have consequences, be it geopolitical or geoeconomic or societal. And it's up to us, the ones who cherish freedom and democracy, and the ones who want to live in open societies, to continue to fight for our way of life. So I do not believe that this pandemic would be bringing additional, if you want, traction from nations or non-state actors that do not share our values. I do believe that the political West will get out of this crisis stronger. I think we'll learn that we need each other. I think we'll understand even once more how important it is to have a strong NATO, to have a strong transatlantic bond, and make sure that around the world we embrace the nations that are freedom-loving and doing this. Probably there will be also some other consequences that today are difficult to forecast. Richard Haas from the Council of Foreign Relations just wrote that this would be a major accelerator of the trends already existing on technology, on innovation. We'll see. But the fundamental question and the fundamental answer we have to give to ourselves is what kind of societies we want to live in. And if the answer is, as I know it is, that we want to live in open, prosperous, democratic societies, then we have to reinvest our energy, our resources, our talent, our leadership in making sure that we adapt, we thrive, and we continue to be the essential part of the global system of global order.
Well, thanks, Deputy Secretary General. And finally, and again, unfortunately, this time in less than 10 seconds, Brooks Tickner of Jane's Defence Weekly wanted to know if NATO is planning to increase its staff looking at disinformation and fake news campaigns, given the role that these seem to have played in the crisis thus far. And I know you've commented on that topic as well.
I cannot comment on my colleagues dealing with this. Would love to listen to me saying that will augment the people, but we are amplifying across the NATO enterprise. And as I mentioned, together with the key allies, together with the EU, together with other organizations, our vigilance. We are producing also for the general public a weekly panorama, if you want, of the world of disinformation and fake news and conspiracy theories. We are stepping up our game, and I want to reassure everybody that we are on top of our game and will continue to do our job as we've done in every single other situation when crisis, tensions, and potential risks to our security have occurred in our long history and successful history as an alliance.
Well, Minister Geoană, Deputy Secretary General, thank you so much again for joining us today. I wish we had double the time to listen more to you, but thank you on behalf of the Friends of Europe audience. Thank you so much again. We had our first meeting with you virtually, and maybe if the crisis continues, we'll have more of these online, but I hope also that once the crisis is past, we can see you in person down at Friends of Europe for one of our debating events.
It will be an advocate of physical
my pleasure and our
encounters.
pleasure to welcome you there. But let me also close by thanking NATO's Public Diplomacy Division for the good cooperation in facilitating your participation. And let me then thank everybody again and wish you, sir, a good and productive week. Thank you again.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Friends of Europe. NATO engages.
Bye-bye for now.